They told him he wouldn't manage it. Not out loud, not always. It showed in the way conversations paused when he entered a room, in the way help was offered too quickly, then taken back. He stood in the kitchen at dawn holding a cup he hadn't finished, listening to a child breathe in the next room. The house felt smaller than it used to. Every decision now carried weight. If he failed, there would be no one else to absorb it. He wasn't sure when the change became permanent, only that something had already been lost, and something else was waiting to be tested. The danger wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. It lived in routine, in the next choice, in the way one ordinary day could undo him if he wasn't careful. If this story stays with you, consider subscribing. These are the kinds of stories that don't shout to be heard. He woke before the alarm, not because he was rested, but because the house no longer let him sleep through anything. The light outside was thin and gray. It pressed against the curtains without warmth. For a moment he stayed still, listening. Pipes clicked behind the walls. A car passed outside. Then, from the other room, the sound he waited for, a small, uneven breath, steady enough to mean everything was still okay. He got up slowly. The floor was cold. He stepped around a loose board near the door, the same one he had meant to fix months ago. In the kitchen, he filled the kettle and set it on the stove. He didn't turn on the overhead light. He didn't want the room fully awake yet. The cup he used was chipped along the rim. He'd noticed it before, but never replaced it. He poured water, then forgot about it for a moment, standing with his hands on the counter, staring at nothing. When the kettle whistled, he flinched, then turned it off too quickly, sloshing water onto the burner. He wiped it up with a dish towel that smelled faintly of detergent and something older. This was the first morning he was fully aware of what the day would ask from him. Not in theory, not as a possibility. It was already happening. He checked the clock, earlier than he needed to be up, but the child would wake soon. He opened the fridge and looked inside. Not because he needed to, but because it was what he always did next. Milk, eggs, leftovers in containers he didn't remember filling. He closed the door and leaned his forehead against it briefly, feeling the vibration of the motor. From the hallway came a soft thump. Then another. Bare feet, careful but unsure. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice level. The child stood in the doorway, hair flattened on one side, holding a blanket that dragged slightly along the floor. There was no question yet, just presence. "Morning," the child said. He nodded. "Go sit. I'll make something." He cracked eggs with more force than necessary. A shell slipped into the pan. He fished it out with his fingers and rinsed them under the tap. The water ran longer than needed. He was aware of time in a new way, not as something measured, but as something that could slip past him if he wasn't watching. They ate without speaking. The child pushed food around the plate, then took a few bites. He watched closely but said nothing. When the plate was half empty, he stood and scraped the rest into the trash without comment. He rinsed the dish and placed it in the rack, lining it up carefully with the others. After breakfast, he helped the child get dressed. Socks first, then shirt, then shoes. The motions were familiar, but the order felt newly important. He double-checked the laces. He picked up a jacket and hesitated before handing it over, as if weighing whether the weather would change without warning. At the door, he reached for his keys and stopped. He checked his pocket again, then the counter. They were where they always were. He picked them up and held them for a moment before opening the door. Outside, the air was sharp. The street looked the same as it always had. Neighbors' houses stood quiet. A man down the block was already loading something into his truck. He nodded once. The man nodded back, then looked away. He walked the child to the car and buckled the seatbelt himself, tugging at it twice to make sure it held. The child watched him with a serious expression, as if noticing the extra care. "You okay?" the child asked. He paused. "Yeah," he said, "just tired." They drove in silence. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the mirror. He looked older than he remembered, not dramatically, just enough to be undeniable. When he dropped the child off, he waited until the door closed behind them. He sat in the car for a moment longer, hands on the wheel, engine running. The day had started, whether he was ready or not. He pulled away from the curb, already aware that by the time evening came, this morning would feel distant, not because it didn't matter, but because there would be too many others like it. Before everything changed, his days moved on rails he didn't question. He woke to an alarm he often snoozed once. He dressed in the dark while someone else slept beside him. The house had noise then, even when it was quiet. A shared presence filled the gaps. He didn't think about it. He just moved through it. Mornings were divided without discussion. One of them packed lunches. The other checked backpacks. If something was forgotten, it was noticed before it mattered. There was always a second chance built into the routine. He relied on that without knowing he was doing it. Work came next. The drive was familiar enough that he barely remembered it by the time he arrived. He parked in the same spot when it was open. Inside, his name was known. His role was understood. He did what was asked, stayed late when needed, and left when he could. There was comfort in being useful in a way that didn't ask too much of him. People spoke to him with a certain ease. He was steady, reliable, not someone they worried about. If he mentioned his child, it was received as something admirable, but contained. Fatherhood existed alongside his work, not inside it. It was something he handled elsewhere. Evenings were a return rather than an arrival. Dinner appeared. The child talked more then, filling the space with small details that didn't need to go anywhere. He listened while clearing plates. He corrected homework when asked. If he was tired, it showed, but it didn't stop things from moving forward. There were arguments, but they were brief. There were silences, but they didn't linger. When tension appeared, it passed through the house and left again. He mistook that movement for resolution. Weekends blurred together. Errands, birthdays, small obligations. He showed up when he was supposed to. He brought what he was told to bring. He didn't consider what would happen if one of them stopped doing their part. At night, he sat on the couch and scrolled through his phone while the television played something neither of them watched closely. The child slept down the hall. The house held them without effort. It felt stable enough to be permanent. There were signs he ignored. A tone that flattened. A schedule that shifted. Conversations that ended sooner than they used to. He noticed them, but only as inconveniences. He assumed there would be time to correct them later. When the child asked questions then, they were answered quickly. There was confidence in his voice that came from knowing someone else was carrying part of the weight. He didn't worry about saying the wrong thing. If he did, someone else would adjust it later. Looking back, nothing about that life seemed extravagant. It wasn't especially happy or especially hard. It just functioned. That was its strength, and also its weakness. On one evening not long before everything changed, he stood in the kitchen while someone else washed dishes. He dried and stacked them without thinking. The child sat at the table drawing something unrecognizable. He glanced at the picture and nodded. "Looks good," he said. The child smiled, satisfied. He didn't know that this was the kind of moment that wouldn't return in the same way. Not because it was perfect, but because it depended on balance. And balance, he would learn, is often mistaken for permanence. That night, he went to bed assuming tomorrow would follow the same shape. He didn't set anything aside. He didn't prepare. There was no sense of urgency. The rails were already ending. He just hadn't felt the shift yet. People thought they knew him. Not deeply, but enough to place him somewhere familiar. He was the kind of man others felt comfortable categorizing. Quiet, dependable, not ambitious in ways that made anyone uneasy. He didn't demand attention, so none was given beyond what was required. At work, his name carried a certain tone. When it was said in meetings, it was followed by nods, not questions. He handled his part. He didn't complain. If something needed to be covered, he was asked because he usually said yes. It wasn't authority exactly, it was usefulness. There was a difference, even if no one said it out loud. Supervisors spoke to him plainly. There was no edge in their voices, no caution. They assumed availability, not out of disrespect, but habit. He had never corrected that assumption. He'd stayed late when asked, shifted schedules without resistance. It felt easier than explaining his life outside the building. When his child came up in conversation, it was framed as something admirable but contained. "Good dad," someone once said, clapping him lightly on the shoulder. The comment ended there. No follow-up, no adjustment. It didn't change how deadlines were set or how expectations were framed. Fatherhood was something he did after hours. Friends spoke to him the same way. Invitations came with flexibility, then slowly without it. If he hesitated, plans moved on. No one pressed. They assumed he'd catch up later. He usually did. When he didn't, no one mentioned it. Family saw him through an older lens. He was responsible but not fragile. Capable, but not in need of guidance. Advice was offered casually, often prefaced with, "You'll figure it out." It was meant as encouragement. It also kept distance. He didn't push against any of it. The version of himself others carried felt accurate enough at the time. He liked being seen as steady. It meant fewer questions, fewer explanations. He mistook that ease for respect. The child fit neatly into this image. When people saw them together, they smiled. They commented on resemblance. They didn't linger. No one looked closely enough to see who was adjusting to whom. The child followed his lead. He didn't notice how much that depended on structure he wasn't maintaining alone. There were moments when he sensed the limits of how others saw him. A project reassigned without discussion. A promotion discussed vaguely, then shelved. A comment about flexibility that carried a quiet assumption. He registered these things without naming them. He told himself they didn't matter. At a neighborhood gathering, someone asked how things were going. He said good out of habit. The answer landed easily and passed on. No one pressed. The question had been polite, not curious. He learned early how to stay within the lines drawn for him, not consciously. It was something he absorbed. If he didn't disrupt expectations, things stayed smooth. That seemed like success. When tensions at home began to show, he didn't share them, not because he was hiding, but because it didn't occur to him that others might see him differently if he did. He assumed private strain stayed private, that it didn't alter public roles. He didn't realize how narrow that role was until it began to shift. The first sign came quietly. A meeting rescheduled without asking his availability. A look exchanged when he mentioned needing to leave early. Nothing confrontational. Just a recalibration he hadn't agreed to. He noticed people waiting for him to falter before offering help, as if they were already anticipating a version of him that couldn't keep up. The thought unsettled him more than he expected. He didn't argue against it. He just worked harder. At home, the child asked more questions. At work, fewer were asked of him. The balance began to tilt, though the surface stayed calm. He still believed effort would be enough, that if he stayed quiet and capable, the shape of his life would hold. He didn't understand yet that capability, once questioned, doesn't regain its footing easily. By the time he sensed that others were adjusting their expectations downward, he was already carrying more than they knew. He hadn't failed, but the space around him was narrowing. People hadn't turned against him. They simply began to see him differently. And once that happens, the world responds in small, cumulative ways. He felt it most in what was no longer offered without him asking. The role he had fit into so easily was starting to shift, not because he changed it, but because the conditions that supported it were thinning. He hadn't said anything yet. He was still standing where people expected him to stand, but the ground beneath that place was no longer solid. The conversation happened in the afternoon, when the day still looked salvageable. Sunlight came through the window at an angle that suggested time left to adjust. He sat at the table, hands folded, listening. The words were careful, measured. No one raised a voice. That was what made it final. There was a pause before each sentence, as if space itself might soften the meaning. It didn't. He understood what was being said before it finished being said. This wasn't a threat or a warning. It was a conclusion reached somewhere else and delivered here. He nodded when it seemed appropriate. He asked one question that didn't change the answer. The air in the room stayed even. Nothing broke. No objects were moved. It was a moment designed to leave no evidence except consequence. Later, paperwork appeared. He signed where he was told to sign. His name looked unfamiliar on the page, as if it belonged to someone else. He didn't reread anything. There was no clause that offered revision. The child sat nearby, focused on something small in their hands. When it was over, they looked up and asked, "Are we going home now?" He said yes. The answer was true in the narrowest sense. At home, he moved through the rooms with intention. He opened drawers. He folded clothes. He packed what belonged to the child first. Shirts, socks, the jacket they always reached for without looking. He placed everything carefully, as if order might substitute for explanation. The child followed him from room to room, silent but present, watching. When they asked where something should go, he told them. When they asked why, he said, just helping. By evening, the house had changed shape, not dramatically, but enough to feel wrong. Space appeared where it hadn't existed before. A chair sat unused. A shelf emptied without replacement. He cooked dinner from what was left. The food tasted the same. He noticed because he expected it not to. The child ate without comment, then carried their plate to the sink. He watched them do it and felt something settle uncomfortably in his chest. That night, he sat at the table alone after the child went to bed. He checked his phone. There were messages he didn't open. Notifications he dismissed without reading. He stared at the surface of the table, tracing a scratch with his finger until it disappeared under the grain. He didn't cry. He didn't feel relief. There was only a sense of compression, like something had tightened and locked into place. The next morning, the reality of it arrived through logistics, schedules that no longer aligned, forms that needed updating, calls that couldn't be postponed. He stood in line with the child beside him, filling out information he hadn't planned to provide alone. At one desk, a woman asked a question and then paused. "So it's just you now," she said, not unkindly. "Yes," he said. She nodded and continued typing. The word just lingered longer than it should have. At work, he informed his supervisor in the briefest way possible. There was sympathy, a hand on his shoulder, an offer of flexibility that came with an expiration he could hear even if it wasn't stated. "Let us know what you need," the supervisor said. He thanked them and returned to his desk. The work was the same. His focus wasn't. That afternoon, the child asked when things would go back to normal. He didn't answer right away. He knelt to their level and said, "This is normal now." The child considered that. "Okay," they said. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than anger would have. That evening, he stood in the doorway of the child's room longer than necessary. He watched him sleep, one arm thrown over the pillow, face relaxed. The room held familiar objects, unchanged. It looked prepared for continuity. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He didn't think about what he had lost. He thought about what was now fixed. The choices ahead of him no longer included retreat. He realized then that the moment had already passed. Not the conversation, not the signing. The real moment was this, standing in a quiet house that would not return to its previous shape, no matter how carefully he moved through it. There was no anger to spend, no blame to assign, only a path that narrowed into necessity. He turned off the light and went to bed without setting an alarm he could rely on. The next day would require him whether he was ready or not. The change had settled. It wasn't waiting to be understood. It was already in place. The days that followed didn't announce themselves as difficult. They arrived one after another, each asking for small, specific things. Wake up, get dressed, prepare food, drive, work, return, repeat. There was no single moment he could point to and say this is where it became heavy. The weight gathered slowly, in pieces too small to refuse. Morning shortened. He learned how long he could stand still before the child noticed. He timed showers to the minute. He packed lunches the night before and still forgot something twice a week. When that happened, he told himself it wasn't a failure, just a correction. At work, his focus thinned. He reread emails. He missed the deadline by hours, then apologized once and didn't explain. His supervisor accepted it, then quietly reassigned part of the workload. The change wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as support. He felt the difference anyway. Evenings were quieter than he expected. The child spoke less, not out of sadness, but adaptation. They learned when to interrupt and when not to. They stopped asking for things twice. He noticed and adjusted, then noticed again that he shouldn't have needed to. Laundry piled up faster than before. He ran smaller loads more often, trying to stay ahead of it. Sometimes he forgot a load in the washer overnight and had to start again. He didn't complain. He folded clothes while the child did homework at the table, both of them working without comment. There were phone calls he avoided, friends checking in, family asking how he was holding up. He answered briefly, then let the conversation end. Not because he didn't appreciate it, but because explaining felt like another task. He didn't have language for what was happening that wouldn't invite advice. The child began waking at night, not every night, just often enough to matter. A bad dream, a sound outside, a quiet "Dad" from the doorway. He got up each time. He sat on the edge of the bed until breathing steadied. He returned to his own bed and lay awake longer than necessary, listening to the house settle. On weekends, he stayed in more, not intentionally. It just took more effort to leave. He planned outings that fell through because of weather, or timing, or fatigue. When that happened, the child accepted it without protest. That acceptance unsettled him more than disappointment would have. Money tightened, not enough to panic, but enough to require attention. He reviewed statements late at night, subtracting costs, delaying purchases. He stopped buying things that weren't needed. He told himself it was temporary. At school events he stood alone. Other parents spoke in pairs or small groups. He nodded, exchanged brief comments, then focused on the child. Teachers addressed him carefully, double-checking information they used to assume someone else would confirm. He answered questions clearly. He didn't volunteer more than asked. Once, after pickup, the child dropped their bag and the contents spilled across the pavement. Papers scattered. Crayons rolled toward the curb. He crouched down and gathered everything quickly, hands moving faster than necessary. A car honked. He waved without looking up. The child watched him and said nothing. That night he forgot to eat dinner. He realized it only when he felt lightheaded, standing at the sink. He leaned against the counter until it passed, then made something small and ate it standing up. He washed the dish immediately. The quiet of the house became something he had to manage. Not silence exactly, but the absence of interruption. There was no one to step in if he paused too long, no one to fill space while he regrouped. If he stopped, everything stopped with him. He started making lists, not long ones, just enough to hold the day together. He crossed items off as he completed them, not for satisfaction, but to be sure they were done. He added new ones as they appeared. The list never got shorter. One evening, after the child went to bed, he sat on the floor and sorted mail he'd been avoiding. Bills, forms, notices. He stacked them carefully and placed them where he would see them in the morning. He didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt contained. At work the next week, a meeting ended without him contributing. He'd followed the discussion, but hadn't found a moment to speak. When it was over, someone summarized decisions he'd already understood. No one asked his opinion. He didn't offer it. The loss wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. His role adjusted to match what others assumed he could carry. At home, the child learned where things were kept. They stopped asking where to find socks. They poured their own cereal. He noticed and corrected himself when he felt a flash of pride. This wasn't independence earned. It was necessity. One night, while brushing teeth side by side, the child looked at him in the mirror and asked, "Do you get tired a lot now?" He paused, toothbrush still. "A little," he said, "but I'm okay." The child nodded and returned to brushing. After they went to bed, he stood in the bathroom longer than needed, watching the mirror fog and clear again. He didn't feel strong. He didn't feel broken. He felt used, in the way tools do when they are relied on, without rest. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full of things that needed doing and no one else to notice if they weren't done. He learned its shape by living inside it, and each day, without marking it, he carried on. Not because it was admirable, but because stopping wasn't an option. The change didn't arrive as a realization. It came through repetition, through watching the same small adjustments happen without discussion. He noticed how the child adapted to new limits with little resistance, how expectations shifted quietly, as if they had always been this way. One morning, he overslept, not by much, enough to rush. He moved faster than he should have, bumping into furniture, dropping a spoon on the floor. The child stood by the door, already dressed, backpack on, waiting. "You ready?" the child asked. "Yeah," he said, catching his breath. "Sorry." They walked to the car without speaking. He buckled the seatbelt, then paused, hand resting on the latch longer than necessary. The child watched him. "You don't have to be fast," the child said. "We still get there." He looked at them. "I know." They didn't argue. They didn't reassure him. They just accepted the pace as it was. At home that evening, the child set the table without being asked. Plates first, then utensils. One fork was missing. The child went back to the drawer and found it. They placed everything carefully, then sat down and waited. He noticed the order. Not as a failure on his part, but as information. The child wasn't stepping in because he asked. They were doing it because it made the evening work. After dinner, he reached for the sponge. The child stood beside him and dried the plates. He almost told them they didn't need to. The words stayed where they were. Later, while folding laundry, he watched the child pair socks without instruction. They missed one match and corrected it themselves. He didn't comment. He folded shirts more slowly than usual, aware of the rhythm they were finding together. That night, while getting ready for bed, the child asked, "Is it just us now?" "Yes," he said. The child considered that. "Okay." There was no sadness in the voice, no relief, just a statement. Then, after a pause, the child said, "That means you don't have to share me." The sentence landed without emphasis. It wasn't framed as comfort or accusation. It was simply true from the child's perspective. He didn't respond right away. He sat on the edge of the bed and adjusted the blanket, smoothing it flat. The child watched him with a neutral expression, waiting. "I still share you," he said finally, "with school, with friends." The child nodded. "But I come back." "Yes," he said. That was the moment, not because it explained anything, but because it removed something. The idea that he was failing at replacement, that he was meant to be two roles instead of one. The child wasn't measuring what was missing. They were measuring what remained. The next morning, he changed how he moved through the day, not dramatically. He left earlier instead of rushing. He packed lunches while the child packed their bag. He stopped trying to fill silence with reassurance. At work, he declined an extra task without apology. The supervisor looked surprised, then nodded. The task went to someone else. Nothing collapsed. He began adjusting expectations instead of defending them. When someone offered help, he accepted it once, then returned it later in a different form. He stopped trying to appear unaffected. The child noticed the shift before anyone else. They spoke more again. Not constantly, just enough to fill the space naturally. They told him about things that didn't matter and expected him to listen. He did. One evening, while walking home, the child lagged behind, scuffing shoes against the pavement. He slowed without turning around. They matched his pace without comment. He realized then that the work wasn't about compensating. It was about consistency. Showing up in the same way, even when the way had changed. The house didn't feel lighter, but it felt clearer. He no longer waited for permission to define what worked for them. He stopped thinking of the days as something to survive. They became something to arrange. The child didn't ask if he was tired anymore. They assumed he would be, and stayed with him anyway. The opportunity arrived without warning. An email sent late in the afternoon, marked urgent, but written in the same neutral tone as everything else. A role opening. More responsibility. Better pay. Travel required. Longer hours, framed as flexibility. He read it twice. Then a third time. On paper, it solved things. The numbers worked. The title carried weight. It was the kind of step people expected him to take eventually. The kind that would reassure others he was still moving forward. He didn't respond right away. That evening, he cooked dinner while the child worked on homework at the table. A question came up. He answered it. Another followed. He leaned over the table and pointed to the page, explaining slowly. The child nodded. Erased something. Tried again. After dinner, he washed dishes while the child read on the couch. He glanced at the clock and pictured late nights. Hotel rooms. Missed mornings. Someone else handling pickup. someone else stepping in where he wouldn't be. He sat down beside the child and asked what they were reading. They told him, then read a line out loud without being prompted. He listened. Later, after the child went to bed, he opened his laptop again. He drafted a response, then deleted it. He stood and paced the living room once, then sat back down. The next day, he spoke to his supervisor in person. He asked direct questions. The answers were polite and practiced. There would be support. There would be understanding. There would be expectations. He thanked them and said he needed time. When he told family, reactions came quickly. Confusion first, then concern, then suggestions framed as certainty. He listened and didn't argue. He ended the calls without resolution. At school pickup, another parent mentioned the opening. Word had traveled. "That's big," they said. "Good for you." He nodded. That night, the child asked why he was quiet. "I'm deciding something," he said. "Do I help?" the child asked. He shook his head. "No, you just be here." The child accepted that and returned to what they were doing. He sent the email the following morning. Short, clear, grateful. He declined. The response came quickly. Polite, professional. A door left open, in language only. At work, the shift was subtle but immediate. Projects adjusted, conversation shortened. Someone else stepped into the space he might have occupied. No one said anything unkind. They didn't need to. He felt the loss in small ways. Less inclusion. Fewer assumptions of growth. The version of him others carried recalibrated again. At home, nothing changed that day. Dinner still needed making. Homework still needed checking. The child still needed to be tucked in. While turning off the light, the child asked, "Are you done deciding?" "Yes," he said. "Okay," the child said, already turning over. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, then closed the door. The cost didn't announce itself as sacrifice. It appeared as narrowing, as fewer options spoken out loud, as a path chosen without witnesses. He didn't feel proud. He felt steady. The world around him adjusted, whether he approved or not. He stayed. The house did not return to what it had been. It settled into something else. The change was not visible to anyone passing by. The paint stayed the same. The furniture didn't move much, but the way mornings began shifted, and that was enough. He woke before the alarm most days, not from tension anymore, but habit. He moved through the kitchen without hesitation. Coffee first, then breakfast. The child joined him when ready, sometimes speaking, sometimes not. Both were acceptable. Silence no longer felt like something to manage. They left the house together. The timing worked without rushing. If it didn't, they adjusted. He no longer measured success by whether everything went smoothly. He measured it by whether they arrived intact. At work, he did what was required and no more. He wasn't overlooked so much as placed. He understood the position clearly now. It came with limits. He no longer tried to stretch. When his name was left out of conversations, he noticed and returned to his desk without resentment. Evenings arrived predictably. He cooked meals he could make without thinking. The child helped sometimes, other times not. He didn't assign meaning to either. After dinner, they sat in the same room doing different things. The closeness didn't require attention. The child began leaving their shoes by the door instead of in the hallway. Coats hung where they belonged. Homework was done with fewer reminders. These weren't signs of maturity so much as familiarity. The systems they'd built held. One night, the power went out during a storm. The lights cut suddenly. The child startled, then looked at him. He found a flashlight without searching. They sat together on the couch, listening to rain hit the windows. The outage didn't feel like a disruption, just another condition to move through. "You used to hate this," the child said. "I still do," he said. "Just less." The child smiled briefly, then leaned against him. He stayed still until the power returned. Weeks passed. Then more. He stopped counting. At a school event, he stood with the other parents and listened. When spoken to, he responded. When not, he watched the child from a distance. The child waved once, then returned to what they were doing. He waved back and didn't follow. Money stabilized. Not because there was more of it, but because he knew where it went. He replaced the chipped cup without ceremony. He fixed the loose board by the door. Small repairs he'd postponed before now felt manageable. There were moments when he noticed the absence of what used to be shared. Decisions made alone. Evenings without another adult voice. Those moments arrived without warning and left the same way. He didn't chase them. One morning, while tying the child's shoes, he realized he hadn't checked the time. He finished the knot and stood up. They weren't late. They rarely were anymore. "You ready?" he asked. The child nodded. They walked out together, the door closing behind them with a familiar sound. The house waited. It didn't feel empty. It felt occupied, even when no one was inside. Later that day, he passed a mirror in the hallway and caught his reflection. He looked the same. Tired, maybe. Older, certainly, but not uncertain. He no longer wondered whether others thought he would fail. The question had lost relevance. The story had moved on without needing consensus. That evening, after the child went to bed, he sat at the table and reviewed the next day's schedule. He made one adjustment, then closed the notebook. There was nothing else to prepare. Before turning off the light, he checked the child's door. It was open, just enough. He left it that way. The house held what it needed to hold now. No more, no less. And in the quiet that followed, there was no sense of rewriting anything, only of continuing.